So you had already been serving. You'd already done a course of study. You'd already been serving in ministry. I'm One of the questions that I got from one of my youth was, "What's the main difference between monastic life and other forms of Christian discipleship?" And I'm curious if you would tell us a little bit about the difference between a calling to become a monk versus maybe just a calling into ordained ministry.
Well, let's do a little history, and then that will help me to answer that question. For Jesus and John the Baptist, there was a time where they went into the desert to be alone in prayer with the Father. And the monastic communities developed as Constantine received baptism and he and his whole retinue entered the church. So the age of giving your life completely to God through martyrdom came to an end, and a person who wanted to give themselves completely to God went to the desert along the Nile River in Egypt. And those first communities were eremitical, they were hermits. But the hermit life is very difficult. So they wanted to gather together and have a teacher and have support. So the Cenobitic life evolved in the 2nd century. And in the 5th century, St. Benedict wrote a rule for those who want to live in community while seeking to follow a way of silence and prayer. Today, monastic life can have an apostolic component of service, teaching, hospital ministry, the service of a congregation in a parish. But those who follow the rule as we do say we separate ourselves and live by 3 vows. And the vows are obedience, stability, and conversatio morum. And the vow of obedience, obviously, you do what you're asked to do. Stability, you don't go off the monastery property unless you have a medical appointment or assigned to work. And conversatio morum is a loose term that means always turning to God, living in such a way that you avoid the distractions that occupy you so that you are not completely, as best you're able, focused on God. So in our life here, we are not providing service to a congregation or visiting the sick or taking on those roles. As St. Paul says in his letter, not everybody has the same task. So if your call is to come apart and enter into this way of prayer, you make the sacrifice of ministerial service in order that you might engage in a very deliberate way of praying, stopping 7 times a day with the other members of the community to come together. And you and I spoke earlier about this whole divine office or Opus Dei or the work of God, but to pray in a very organized way that leads you to constantly be in touch with God's word, with God's revelation.